Oh, Squared. I was just reading the Bible, and I have some questions about the way that God punishes people. Care to discuss? Oh, well, usually I focus on more philosophical stuff, but I'd still like to hear your questions. Thank you. Let's start with Adam and Eve. They sinned, and suddenly all of humanity is somehow cursed. How is it just to make a punishment that passes on to one's entire species? Why not just Adam and Eve? And then later on, there's Noah's flood, which was supposed to punish the world, but I take it that a lot of innocent babies drowned in the process. Why did God punish innocent children? Then, during the plagues of Egypt, God explicitly torments all the Egyptians. Wouldn't that have hurt a lot of innocent Egyptians like children? To make matters worse, God then kills all the Egyptian firstborn as a punishment. Later, when the Israelites worshipped that golden calf, God's initial plan was to kill the entire nation. Wouldn't that have killed some innocent people? Why not just those that worshipped the calf? Even if you want to maintain that literally 100% of everyone in the nation worshipped the calf, that still doesn't explain why God would have killed all the innocent children in the nation. Also, even after Moses taught God out of this plan, the alternative was getting the Levites to run throughout the camp, killing people indiscriminately. But shouldn't they have, discriminated between people who were actually guilty and those that weren't? Then there was Korah's rebellion, where the leader of a rebellion was killed along with his family, including innocent children. Why not just the adults who partook in the rebellion? And then later, there's the whole conquest of the Canaanites thing that once again killed a bunch of innocent people, including children. Why did God command the slaughter of innocents? Even after Israel established itself as a nation, this sort of thing still happened. One time, Philistine warriors stole the Ark of the Covenant, so the entire nation was hit with plagues. Why not just the Philistine warriors? Another notable example of the way God punishes people is this one time when King David sinned, and the entire nation of Israel was struck with yet another plague. Why not just punish King David? I have more examples, but you get the idea. I have some serious issues with the way that your God punishes people. Man, you've been reading a lot. Well, I believe I have an answer to those objections. The problematic aspects of these punishments can be explained by employing a particular moral theory, which I call moral collectivism. Now, I want to be very clear, I am not endorsing moral collectivism in this video. I'm not saying it's true. I am, however, saying that it's worth pondering and thinking about. So, let's do that. First, let's start by asking the question, what sorts of things have moral status? By having moral status, I mean being able to receive moral praise or moral blame. Well, inanimate objects like rocks do not have moral status because they can never be guilty or praiseworthy. What about humans? Yep, most of us are capable of being morally guilty or praiseworthy, except for infants and stuff like that. Animals? Well, that one's tricky. When a pet disobeys its owner, is it guilty in a moral sense? I don't think so, but this is definitely more of a gray area than, say, rocks. Now, the moral theory that I would like to explore here is the idea that collections or groups of people can have moral status. On moral collectivism, collections of people can be guilty or praiseworthy based on the actions of the members of the collection. To be clear, I don't just mean that everyone in a collection has moral status. Rather, I mean that there's this thing over and above each individual, the collection of them, that itself possesses moral status in addition to each member having moral status. To put it another way, when we say this group of humans is guilty, instead of just interpreting that as every human in this group is guilty, moral collectivism offers a second interpretation. There's this thing, the group of humans, and it's guilty due to the guilt of its members. Now, moral collectivism raises a bunch of questions, like what sorts of collections of people have moral status? Well, the moral collectivism I'm outlining here does not maintain that just any collection of people forms a group with moral status or a moral group. The collection of all people with 7 letters in their first name does not have a moral status. Rather, families or nations are the sorts of collections that have moral status. Why are families and nations collections with moral status, but not people with 7 letters in their first name? Well, I won't be exploring that much here, because that's all we need for this video. But one route you could go is that collections of people with a shared characteristic tied to one's identity have moral status. Moving on, now that I've laid out moral collectivism, there are two broad ways of employing it to understand the way God's punishments work. The first way, which would be employed by someone with a more literalistic reading of the Bible, would say that the authors of the Bible correctly believed in moral collectivism, and this explains God's actions. The second way, which would be employed by someone with a more figurative reading of the Bible, would say that the authors of the Bible incorrectly believed in moral collectivism, and this helps us interpret the text. Let's start by looking at the literalist's use of moral collectivism to explain how God's punishments work. The literalist will have you know that God will punish the guilty due to his infinite justice. Now, if there's a collection of people with moral status, and a bunch of the members of this collection sin, well then this collection is guilty. Since God punishes the guilty, he has to punish the collection. But the only way to punish a collection of people is to bring suffering on the members. So, God fulfills the demands of justice by bringing about suffering on the members of the collection. However, some members of the collection might not have sinned. Yet, through the just punishment of the collection which they are part of, they too are suffering. So it looks like God is punishing the innocent, when in reality he is punishing a guilty collection, and some of the members are caught in the crossfire. The literalist will also want to add another component to their moral collectivism. Some people within a collection of humans have a special status such that their guilt or praiseworthiness disproportionately affects the guilt or praiseworthiness of that collection. So, their sins affect the guilt of the collection much more than the guilt of another member of the collection. Now, some examples of people with this special status would be, in a nation, the ruler of that nation, or in a family, the parents. People who are the heads, so to speak, of the collection they belong to. So, in the Bible, you might have, for example, a king who sinned greatly, thus bringing guilt upon the nation. And since the nation is guilty, God will punish the nation. This is unfortunate, yes, because most members of the nation did nothing wrong. But this is not something unjust for God to do. He isn't actually punishing the innocent on moral collectivism. He is punishing the guilty group, and the innocent are unfortunately caught in the crossfire. More generally, take any biblical story where it looks like an innocent person is getting punished. The literalist can maintain that they're part of a guilty group, and their suffering contributes to punishing that group. Well squared, I can't overstate how counterintuitive this theory really is. I get where you're coming from, and that's why I haven't bought into moral collectivism myself. However, I think that the literalist proponent of moral collectivism would try to undercut the reliability of the specific intuition by saying that it's the product of a modern, individualistic culture that has skewed your ability to recognize the moral status of collections of people. If you had grown up in a culture that didn't overemphasize individuality so much, like ours has, then you would find moral collectivism obviously true, and its implications about punishment would be more palatable. This isn't an argument for moral collectivism, though. It is simply an attempt at diffusing its counterintuitiveness. Now, the literalists can also employ moral collectivism to help explain other doctrines as well. Like if the literalist adheres to penal substitution, they can offer an account of how that works. The idea would be that prior to conversion, an individual sinner is a collection consisting of one member, themselves. But when they put their faith in Christ, he joins that guilty collection. And when Christ died on the cross, the full wrath of God was poured out on him. He suffered so much that the guilt of any collection he is a part of has been thoroughly punished. This can also explain the incarnation. In his divine form, Christ didn't share enough characteristics with us humans to actually be a part of our morally relevant collections, but he was able to join them by taking on a human nature. The literalists can also make sense of the doctrine of original sin. Adam and Eve are in a sense the head of all humanity, so their guilt transfers to a collection that includes the whole human race. Thus, we are all under the sin of Adam and Eve. So, moral collectivism can be incorporated into a bunch of Christian doctrines. Now, the figurativists can go another route. They could say that moral collectivism is so counterintuitive that it must be false. However, it can still be useful in dealing with a problem that figurativists have. Many figurativists believe that a lot of biblical accounts depict God doing morally problematic things, so they maintain that these accounts aren't literally true. But they're still left with the question, since the Bible is inspired by God, why did he decide to include stories of himself doing morally problematic things, whether or not they're literally true? What's he trying to teach the original audience? Well, let's take a look at how a figurative story works. Boiled down, there's some text that the original audience interprets into a story with characters that interact, from which a takeaway is drawn. However, if the original audience believes in moral collectivism, this will change the way they interpret the text, and there will be different characters, and thus a different takeaway. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine there's a text that we read and interpret as being about the characters Alice, Bob, and so on. Well, the original audience, if they believed moral collectivism, would interpret this as being about Alice, Bob, etc., and a collection of these characters. This collection is also a character in a sense, since it has a moral status. At least that's how it would be interpreted, and that's how God knows it would be interpreted. So if the characters are punished in the story, it's wrong to view it through the lens of the individual characters being punished. God wrote it to the original audience, and thus intended it to be interpreted as a story of him punishing the collection. Take the story of the plagues of Egypt. If you interpret this as a story of God versus the Egyptians, you'll be left scratching your head. Wouldn't some of the Egyptians be innocent like the children, but they nonetheless suffered due to the plagues? Well, that's not how you're supposed to interpret it. You're supposed to interpret it as God versus Egypt, the collection of Egyptians. This collection has a lot of guilt on its hands, due to its slavery and baby murder. So, this is a story about God punishing an evil character worthy of every plague it gets due to its immense guilt. This is not an innocent character in the least. Now, the figurativist can say all this while maintaining that there is no such thing as a collection of Egyptians with moral status. They believe that biblical stories like this aren't meant to be interpreted as literally true. So the idea that collections of people can have moral status can help one out, either by adopting it as a true theory, or by maintaining that it was simply believed to be true, and using this as an interpretive framework. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and support me on Patreon if you enjoy this content.